And when he made that kind of a deal, you've heard the expression, make a deal with the devil. Because apparently, I mean, I wasn't there, but apparently the story says that when Rabbi Hanania was dying on his deathbed, his students were speaking with him as disciples, and they were asking him, does he have any regrets in life? Like many of us, we wished we did this, or we thought we moved. And he said, I mourn that I made a deal for the Jews. But, he felt so bad. He had a very tough life. He was a great big guy, although back then being big was a plus. It meant you were successful. You ate well. You had money. You were prosperous. And he would sit near the Beit HaMikdash by the walls of Jerusalem, and people would come to him and ask him for advice. And apparently he was so handsome that all the women loved him. And he had 10 children. And out of the 10 children, if I'm not wrong, I could be wrong, but check it out. I think every single one of them died. Nice. And he would save the teeth from these children that died. It's a very, very tough. But one of the things that he taught us was that we have to do what we can to survive. And as a people, as Jews, whether we're conservative, reform, orthodox, reconstructionists, whatever it is, we have ways of finding a way to fit into society. Meaning, some of you might start a Seder early because of the grandchildren. Is it right? We're supposed to start after dark. Some of us say, well, I have to do it for Shalom Bayit, or else that my children won't come and they won't bring grandchildren. Some of us say, it's better to be peaceful and do things that you can do than not be peaceful. And the conservative movement started in this direction. Forget about the mechitza. Forget about the idea of a mechitza, separate seating. We won't even get into that. Let's talk about the issue of driving, using a car, getting in a car and driving to shul. Now, personally, I think if you can come to shul and you want to drive to be in the shul that you want to be in, then that's wonderful. You're coming to shul. You're not driving to go shopping at Yorkdale for shoes, because that you can do on Tuesday or Wednesday, or Sunday even today. You don't even have to do it on Shabbat. You know what I mean? It used to be, that was the only day I could, so you don't have to do that on Shabbat. But if you're driving for the purpose of going to shul and coming home, now no Orthodox rabbi is going to agree with this, because what they say is you're not supposed to pass by one shul to get to another. You're supposed to go to the first shul on your road. But we know even in their community, they don't follow that. They walk past 3 shuls because they have to get to the one that they like. And we know the joke about the one man, and he buys an island. He buys an island in the middle of the lake, and this little island, he has it, and he says, I want a shul. You know the joke, right? He has to have 2 shuls, and he builds 2 shuls. They say, you're one guy. There's how many shuls do you need on one island? He says, I need one shul that I'm going to go to, and one that nobody should go to. The joke is that everybody will talk about some shul that they would never go to. So as Jews, we look for leniencies. That's where I'm going with this. And sometimes we look for leniencies out of convenience, and sometimes we look for leniencies out of necessity as a society. And that's what makes the challenges more interesting. Let's take, for instance, the idea, by the way, the idea of starting a Seder early. Well, the Haggadah originally was never as long back when it was first written as it is today. It's much longer. We've added Hallel, we've added all of the Shachrit prayers and all of these things, which many of you probably skip. You probably do the first part up to the meal. And after the meal, you go to the songs at the back and you sing Adirhu and Chad Gadya and Kilo Na'eh and all of the songs. Why? Because that's the fun part, singing the songs. And the first part is meaningful. You have to do Pesach Matzah Umaror. That's the commandment. That's the mitzvah. Is the mitzvah the rest of it. I mean, the Magid is important. It says, tell your children that we have to teach generation to generation about Pesach. So that's important. So when you start a Seder early, because you have to, because of Shalom Bayit, because of peace in the house, what I would suggest that you do is start with the Magid. Start with the part about the Rabbanim, and the even if you started with Avadim Hayinu and you went forward, and you did the mitzvah of Maror, I would say, so what? It's not the end of the world. Save Kiddush until after candle lighting. So if Yontif starts, if the Pesach starts at 9 o'clock at night, and if you started at 9 o'clock at night, it would be too late for young children. And by the way, where did I get this leniency from? I got it from an Orthodox rabbi, Rabbi Turin. Rabbi Turin was a Talmid Chacham in Toronto. He was at Baycrest. He passed away about 5 years ago. And he wasn't the main rabbi, as we call it. The main pastoral rabbi was Rabbi Berlat, who also passed away. But the second in command was Rabbi Turin, who was a gadol. And Rabbi Turin was getting old, and he didn't want to run the Seder anymore at Baycrest, which was 250 people with families at the Seder. And they approached me at that time, and they asked me if I would lead the Pesach, and I said, "How? I'm going to lead a Seder for 250 people?" I felt like Moshe, not as great as Moshe Rabbeinu when I say that. I felt like, who am I to lead the Seder for them? And Rabbi Turin met with me, and he said to me, "You can do it. You'll sing songs. You'll be pleasant. You'll tell the story. You'll be wonderful. You'll do it." And I said, "All right, I'll do it." And then I found out he was going to be there. And I said, how can I lead a Seder with this giant, this Rav, who really knows, and I'm going to explain things, and he's sitting there. So I said, "Please, Rabbi, you have to participate." And you, no, I'm not involved. It's your show. So, but he gave me some beautiful advice. And then he complimented me afterwards, because he just was a nice man. Even if he didn't like what I did, he wouldn't tell me. And he said to me, after dark, go back and then do Kiddush. And I thought that's fascinating, because you're trying to do things, even though you're starting early, you're putting a shinui, you're putting a twist on how you conduct a Seder by waiting to do Kiddush until after candle lighting. And I thought that's like a chidush to me. It's something new that I hadn't thought of, and I should have thought of it, but I didn't. So leniencies, ways to adjust. So I don't know if I've ever said this before, but I've said this before. I've said that whenever two rabbis get together, there's going to be at least two opinions, maybe three. And there's always going to be a machloket. There's always going to be some kind of disagreement. For those of you that are lawyers in the room, you'll know there is no such thing as the perfect contract. Take any contract, whether it's a mortgage, whether it's a marriage contract, whether it's whatever it is, a legal contract, a document, an employment contract. Leonard, are you a lawyer? I can't remember. No, you're not a lawyer. You know that a contract, there's always something that legislation will bite into and say, well, that's a little unclear. Maybe that could be thought of this way or maybe that way. If you have two opinions that a community can't agree which one is the right opinion, then the right opinion becomes what the community is doing. And that's interesting, because what the community is doing can overrule a dispute between two rabbanim. We know that here, you cannot, no Orthodox rabbi in Toronto is going to say to you, you can go to any bakery you want. It doesn't have to be a kosher bakery, and you can buy bread. It might have milchiks in it. It might have lard in it. It might have fleischiks in it. It might have, who knows what's in it. You can't just do that. You're supposed to buy kosher bread. Buying non-kosher bread or associating with people that are making non-kosher bread is pat akum, right? It could be the bread of idol worshipers. Who worships idols today? Nobody. But the thing is the idea is that what does it lead to? The old joke, it leads to dancing. Well, it leads to, right, Bernie? Right? I always say, I think I got that joke from you, Bernie. I think I got that joke from you many years ago. You told me the joke at the 7 o'clock minion. It leads to dancing. So, dancing could lead to intermarriage. And so they tell us to avoid it. But yet, in France, in Paris, in Paris, and I've never been to France, the Jews are allowed to buy any bread they want. That's what the community does. They want a baguette, they go and they buy a baguette. They know the baguettes in Paris are not made with milchiks. They know how they're made. And they buy them, and they eat them, and they don't worry about them. And that's it. And I think that if the community comes to a decision and they overrule, then that becomes something that the rabbis can't change. Another example, in the laws of nida, in the laws of separation, as we call the menstrual cycle of a woman, there are laws of nida. Who really made the stringencies? According to the Gemara, the women put the stringencies upon themselves to be careful. Maybe the women put the stringencies because they wanted a longer separation from their husbands. Go away, I have to separate for 3 months. Who knows? But the point is the women were incumbent upon themselves to accept those obligations. And that's the way the laws were developed. And the rulings of the community became what the community was doing. So in modern times, can you stop people from doing things eventually? And that's where I was going to before. I was saying in the last class, when you talk about how the automatic timers turn a light on and turn a light off on Shabbat. First of all, the argument that they used was you're not allowed to do anything permanent. And we talked about what is permanent and what is not permanent. Putting two sticks together that you can pull apart to whitewash the top of a wall was not so permanent because you could take them apart. Some people say, I don't want my children making a jigsaw puzzle, putting pieces together on Shabbat because they're creating a picture. Well, I think that's far-fetched. I think that if they want to play and use a puzzle, it's not the end of the world. Some frum people, and now you're going to look at me strangely, will say to the bakery at Sobeys when they buy a birthday cake, put the happy birthday writing on a chocolate plate and put the plate on top of the cake. Why? Because if you write happy birthday with the icing on the cake and you cut through the letters, you're cutting letters and you're destroying the word. You're breaking the wording on Shabbat, and that's asur, it's forbidden. That's how far you can take the laws. And they hold by it. And they hold by it. Now, are they wrong or are they right? Well, they are both, depending on what their community, what they do near Sobeys in that holy neighborhood may be different than what we do in Tzfat and Eretz Yisrael, where in Israel, it's absolutely mostly permissible for most modern Orthodox Jews to put the milchik dishes into the dishwasher, wash the dishes, run a rinse cycle, and then they put the meat dishes into the same dishwasher and they wash the dishes, and they've done them separately, but they've washed the dishes. Why? Because you don't have room in Israel in an apartment for 2 dishwashers in every apartment. So they do what they do. Same thing for Pesach with the microwave, koshering it, not koshering it. Your community might say kosher it. Your rabbi says you can do it, you can do it. Your rabbi says we don't do that in our neighborhood, then we don't do it. So when you have a radio and the radio is going on and off on Shabbat, and a radio, when I talk about a radio, I'm talking about something from the century, but who listens to the radio anymore? I mean, I do, but most people don't listen to a radio. They listen to, I don't know, not even an iPod. Everything is digital and on what's it called? The program that Lily listens to. I'm trying to think of it. Anyway, everybody has music apps, and we listen to music apps and whatever song you want. And I find that people also don't have the time commitment anymore to invest in a whole side of music for the beginning anyway. We grew up in a time where you spun a record, you put a record on it, played, you listen for 15, 20 minutes to the record. Today, I listen to a half a song, I'm fed up with this Dua Lipa number, I'm gonna go on to this number. And they go on from one performer to the next because they're fed to hear this song and then they go to the next song by a different artist. Nobody can commit to a whole side of music anymore. Too long of it. We want everything instantaneously, and if you don't have everything right now, it's not good enough. So I just want to get out some notes here because I want to share a bit of biography with you, because when I talk about people, I don't like to just tell you this person said this. You have to know who these people are. And that's what I find in most shiurim that I attend myself. I have to go back and look at who these people are and really try to understand them, because people say, Chazal says, the Beit Yosef says, the Magen Avraham says, the Rashba says, the Tzitz Eliezer says, like whatever the book is that they wrote, the book says. But who are the people that wrote the books? So there's a question that we were starting to deal with last week, and that was a question about whether the security monitors, these monitors that are on, and you're setting them off or not setting them off, where does that whole concept, where does it come from? So there's a Rav Padwa. He's known as the Cheshev HaYifod. So Rav Padwa is Rav Chanach Dov Padwa. He was born in 1908 in Busk, a very small town in Galicia, which up until yesterday was part of the Ukraine, right? I'm bringing it up because it's right now happening. And his father was Eliezer Wolf, named after him, the rabbi of an area called Alesk. Anyway, at 5 years old, he moved with his family to Vienna to escape the World War. And from an early age, Rav Chanach Padwa was known as the Elui. He was already a Talmudic prodigy. So, he was a young, brilliant kid. He was studying at a yeshiva in Hungary. And he was a Belzer Chassid. And anyway, I don't need to give you the whole history, but just so you know a little bit, that when we talk about a sefer, and you hear the sefer called the Cheshev HaYifod, that's Rav Padwa. Does it matter to you? Not really. But if you ever heard it mentioned, you'd say, I've heard mention that this rabbi said this. And he deals with a question. And when he later on moved to Europe, he became one of the principal rabbanim in London, England. And he was a posek of the Beit Din in Great Britain. Pretty impressive. So I'll pause for a second. There's two questions here. Doreen says, in the old country, did they have separate set of dishes for Pesach, or did they kosher the dishes? You cannot kosher dishes for Pesach, period. So they had to have two sets of dishes, but they did have mostly one set of cutlery, two sets, fleshik and milchik, obviously, and they had pots and pans for everyday use, and they had to kosher their pots and pans. In fact, Rav Moshe Feinstein believed and said openly, it's a shanda de charpa that everybody goes out and buys everything new for Pesach, because it's not fair to the neighbors who can't afford to do that. Not everybody can afford to buy everything, and he felt that Jews should be equal. If you can't afford it, why should I show off that I've got extra pots and pans and cutlery? And it's an interesting point, because I have to tell you, koshering some pots and some cutlery is really not a big deal. He believed that we should do it. It involves you more in Pesach, and it's a good thing to do. But if you can afford it and you're not a show off about it and you want to buy separate cutlery for Pesach, then a bigazin, go ahead and do it. It's not against the law, but it certainly is. Do you need 4 sets of cutlery? Do you need, or 6 sets, or 8 sets, or 10 sets? Because my mother had a set for milchik, a set for fleshik. Then she had the good set for fleshik when company came. Then she had regular milchiks and fleshiks for Pesach. And then she had the good set that we used for the Seders on Pesach. Come on, it's about 6 sets of cutlery. Do you really need it? Not really. So it gets a little bit insane. But anyway, as we became more of a disposable society, that's what happened. So the question that Padwa is dealing with is, he says, a light that automatically goes on when you walk by it has a sensor, and it goes off when you walk away. The person that we are talking about here is a person going to shul. Shabbat morning, a person's walking to shul. And he doesn't care about a light going on and off. That's not his purpose. He's not worrying about a light going on and off. He's worried about getting to shul on time for Birchat HaShachar. And he's on his way to shul. Sometimes you may want a light to go on so that you can see better. You know, it's dark, you can't find your way, you can't see the keyhole, you're fumbling with your keys. Sometimes it's a good thing for a light to go off. But in this case, when you're walking to shul, even if it's for Mincha Shabbat, even if it's for the afternoon when it's already starting to get dark, your purpose of walking to shul is to get to shul. That's different. So the Jewish person who doesn't care about a light going on, in this case of the Cheshav HaEphod, is what they call Psik Reisha de Lo Nicha. I love it. Now, for those of you that attended my kashrut classes, you'll remember that I once talked about something called Psik Reisha. Psik Reisha refers to a man and a child on Shabbat. And the child says, Daddy, I want a toy to play with. And the daddy says, all right, I don't have a toy here. You know, there's no toys. I'll make you a toy. So he goes over and he takes a chicken from the area, and he takes the chicken and he cuts the head of the chicken off, and he says to the kid, here, go play with the chicken head. Now, I don't know what kind of a toy that is, but he says, here, play with it. What happened as a result of making the toy for the father was not thinking about the life of the chicken. He was thinking about making a toy. He didn't care about the life of the chicken. It's a chicken. He cut the neck of the chicken off. He gave the head to the kid. But the Psik Reisha is the cutting off. What happened as a result of doing that was the inevitable result was the killing of the chicken. He killed a chicken on Shabbat. That's a Torah violation. You're not allowed to shecht on Shabbat. That's a Torah. That's not a rabbinic violation. That's a Torah violation. That's very serious. So this is the lo nicha. It's not intention. It's not a problem. In the Gemara, there's a case where a man wants to make a toy, right? He does this. Is the man thinking about the chicken's life? No. So what is the lo nichale? The Jew here doesn't care about the light going on. Lo nicha le klal. He could care less about the light. The light goes on, the light doesn't go on. I don't care. I'm going to shul so I can get the watermelon and the tuna fish scoop and be at Shalashidis and sing songs with Esther. That's why I'm going, not to turn the light on. So it's the lo nicha le. The Jew doesn't care. So an inevitable result, which you don't want to happen, this is the part. An inevitable result which you don't want to happen, in the opinion of Rav Natan, who is the Rosh Yeshiva of Rome and the author of the Aruch, one of our great Rishonim. In his opinion, and really it's a maverick opinion, it's not just an opinion, it's a leading opinion, because he says that Psik Reisha is permitted as long as you don't want it to happen. Therefore, in truth, you don't want the light to go on according to the Aruch. The prohibition of Psik Reisha is that you don't want it to happen. It's not a violation of Shabbos. It's not a violation. And even if you know that it's going to happen, even if you're walking to shul and you know, when I walk by 237 Maxwell, that light's going to go on. I can't help it. There's no other way for me to go. If I go the other way, I could get mugged. There's robbers on Waterloo. I don't want to go on Waterloo. There's bad people there. I have to go on Maxwell and across Shepherd because it's safe. People will see me. I don't want to get mugged on that street. So I'm not going to walk down the dark alley to get to shul. I'm going to walk past 237 Maxwell. I don't know, whatever. What's your address? You don't have to tell us, Esther. We'll all knock on your door. But I'm going to walk by and I know that light's going to come on. Well, even though the Aruch would go far to apply this lenient opinion, we really can't rely on it. Can't rely on it completely. So the Magen Avraham quotes the Rashba. Who's the Magen Avraham? The Magen Avraham is Avraham Abel Gombiner, and he is from the time of 1635 to 1682. He was born in Poland, and he was one of the great Talmudists. Now, when I talk about 1635, that's a long time ago from today. They didn't have lights on Maxwell going off and on in 1635. But according to Magen Avraham, he says that the Gemara in the Yerushalmi, remember we have two Gemaras. We have the Yerushalmi when we have the Babylonian Talmud, right? So he says, he talks about someone, a man who has, now imagine this is the case he brings up because life was different in 1635 than it is today. He talks about a person who has a deer in his house. How many of you have had a deer in your house? And if you ever get one, let me know. I'll come over and shecht it. I've never had kosher deer. So he had a deer in the house, and he intends to have a shochet come to shecht it later on. Of course, after Shabbos, right? Not going to shecht it on Shabbos. The deer's in the house. So the Rashba says, when you leave the house, you are permitted to close the door. So what's the big deal about that? Why should you not be able to close the door on the deer to not let the deer out of the house? Because the shochet's coming after Shabbos to shech the deer. Does anybody know?
Would you not be stressing the deer by containing it?
You're 50% right, Adele.
Better than nothing.
You know, no. That's a very good, it's a 50%. That's pretty good. Because you said stressing the deer, and then you said by containing it. That was the magic word. So your intention is not to trap the deer when you close the door. So you said contain it. Containment is entrapment. It's trapping. Big deal. But trapping is one of the violations of Shabbat. You cannot entrap an animal on Shabbat. You cannot entrap that on Shabbat. Your intention is not to entrap the deer when you go to shul for mincha and you walk past 237 Maxwell and you set off the light of there. Your intention is to go to shul, remember? So your intention is also not to entrap the deer. You're closing the door because if I don't close the door, the Meshigas from Waterloo are going to break into my house and steal everything I have. There's robbers over there on Waterloo. They're going to come over to my house and they're going to break in. I don't want people to break into my house. There's robbers and thieves in the whole city of Toronto. You know, in the 1960s, my parents would leave the house, not lock the door because they're coming back later on. This is Bathurst Manor, 1968, 67. They didn't lock the door. They just went out and you came home, you opened the door and nobody bothered anything. And maybe the neighbor across the street came over and said, I need a cup of milk and took milk out of our fridge. But we knew the neighbor. We didn't care. You know when my parents started locking the door? In 1968. Because we got robbed. We were at the, do you remember Dr. Leitner? That was our eye doctor. We went to see Dr. Leitner, our eye doctor, and we all went for an examination. And after I remember it like yesterday from 8 years old. You know why? Because it was traumatic walking into the house after we were robbed. We came back. My parents took us once a year. We couldn't afford it. We had 3 kids and associated. We went to Marky's Delicatessen, Olive Shalom, Marky's when it was on Bathurst Street, not on Wilson. And they had the hooks on the end of the benches, and you hung your coat up on the hooks, and they had wursts hanging from the ceiling over the cash register. Those were the good old days, okay? So anyway, we used to go home and we'd say, we'll take the wurst, the one that's the most dried out, hard salami, and we bring it home. Anyway, they had kishka and gravy there, I remember. So we come home from Marky's and we get in the house, and all the dressers in the house were turned upside down. They stole the little bit that we had, everything, and we learned our lesson that we have to start locking the door. And at that time, when this man was going to shul for the tuna fish and mincha and the Torah reading and everything that he was getting, his intention is shul. His intention when he goes out is not thinking even about the deer that he has there, that the shechet's coming at 11 o'clock to shech. I'm closing the door, I'm locking the door because my intention, my honest intention is, I don't want the robbers coming in my house. So intentions matter. But maybe your intention is to secure your house to keep the heat in. If you leave the door open and it's February, all the heat that you're trying to make in the house with the furnace is going to blow out the door. So whether or not your intention is to keep the heat in the house, whether your intention is to keep the robbers out of the house, your intention is not to contain, as Adele said, the deer. And your intention is certainly not to trap. So as long as your intention is not to trap the deer when you left and you locked and you closed the door, then it should be okay. But not everybody's happy with that opinion. Not everybody's happy. So what happens is there's another commentary called the Chilte Gaborum. And he says that according to the Rashba, even though we're not allowing pasik reisha, we're not going to allow the cutting off of the chicken to make a toy, because we know the inevitable result is you're killing something on Shabbat. He says, even though we don't allow it and we prohibit it, because it leads to a result. It leads to a result of violating Shabbat. He says, that's not the case of being lenient. The case for being lenient is when we have another legitimate reason for performing the action. There are two ways of performing psik reisha, which leads to a violation of Shabbat. We only spoke about one way. One way is that your action has no other purpose than whatever the inevitable result is. You know you're going to cut the chicken's head off, the chicken's going to die. Assuming you are sincere and you really don't want the inevitable result to happen, it's not the case that we're talking about being lenient. How do we use that in today's world? I'll give you an example. Something modern. You open your refrigerator up on Shabbat, and you go, oi, I forgot to unscrew the light bulb or tape the light bulb, and the light went on, and I caused the light to go on, which, by the way, to me is narishkeit, but I don't make the laws, the rabbis do. Why do I say narishkeit? Because I don't really consider it a permanent thing. The laws relating to Shabbat are about permanence. When I said screwing two blocks of wood together, or cementing two things together, or sewing something together, that's permanent. Even if you took something that was cut with scissors and then you sewed the fabric together, it's not going to look the same. You're creating something permanent. You're doing permanence. Today, honestly, when you flip a light on and you flip a light off, there's no permanence to it. I can have the light off by flipping the switch. I can have the light on by flipping the switch. In fact, nothing is forever. The light is only going to stay on until there's a power failure out there. Once there's a power failure, the light's going to go off anyway. It's like the Shabbat candle. You light the Shabbat candle when you leave it. What's the inevitable? It's going to go out. You didn't make it go out. The candles go out all by itself. Why? Because it runs out of paraffin or wax or oil or whatever it is that we're using. The reservoir in that thing that we talked about, the lantern where it runs out of oil and then the wick goes out. It should be allowed even to light it. And that's why we talked about batteries and flashlights. And we said it's not really permanent. You put the flashlight on, we know the battery's going to drain and wear out. So it's not permanent when you put the flashlight on, but it's not Shabbosdik. Our community doesn't do that. The community doesn't do it. So it doesn't make it a Torah violation. At the worst, it's like a second generation rabbinic violation. And so we look at these things and we say that even though through the generations there are so many opinions that have been rejected, we keep them and we look at them and we refer to them. We don't just erase them. We don't just say, ugh, that opinion's old. We don't follow that anymore. Narishkeit, give it up. Because sometimes even a minhag, a custom, is stronger than a deen, a law. Your family custom might be very important to you if everybody stands for Kiddush on Shabbat. There's no halacha that says you have to stand for Kiddush on Shabbat. It's nice if the person saying Kiddush stands up, but everybody else at the table can be seated. But in a lot of families, and Celia is always already asking, Celia is saying, do we stand or do we sit? Why do we stand? I can see she's out. The answer is you do what your minhag hamakom, whatever your family tradition is, that's what you do. It doesn't matter. It matters what you do. So we don't just throw away an opinion that we don't like if it's regarded highly by others. And we don't just look at them and combine them with other opinions to make and create leniencies. We look for leniencies within the laws, not necessarily out of convenience always, but out of the necessities of the time. Imagine if I said to you, for now on, Shabbat is going to be dark when the sun goes down. You got no lights in your house. I don't care if timer Steimer. We've now ruled that timers are banned. They're not Shabbosdik anymore. It's as bad as not checking your lettuce, chas v'shalom, for a bug. You know, from community, if you don't check your lettuce with a blue light, you're in trouble. I'm not making fun of it. I'm not mocking from people. I'm saying that the reality is what's important to one person is less important to someone else. So what happens is when you take an opinion like that and you say, well, I'm going to look for leniencies, then it could be a problem. But if the leniencies are accepted by the community, nobody's going to all of a sudden rule that timers are banned on Shabbos, because there would be an outcry from the community. They'd say, why should we sit in the dark a whole Shabbos? We can't read the Chumash. As if they're going to sit all night and read the Chumash. Come on, please, don't fool me. I know better. But the thing is you can't enjoy your Shabbos. For the sake of enjoying the Shabbat and the Yom Tov, they made a ruling that these timers would be allowed for lights. The radio, as I talk about, I go, and nobody listens to the radio, but the electronics, the iPads of today, which are going to be the new radios, the iPads, which when you tune in to Central Synagogue, watch the recordings on YouTube for Central Synagogue, for how about Park Avenue Synagogue, they use iPads, the chazan and the rabbis, and they flip through the pages of the iPads for the music and for their sermons and for their siddur. What do we need to have all this printing paper? We're ruining trees. That's worse for the environment than an iPad. We should buy 1,000 iPads, put them in shul. The iPad can have the siddur, the machzor, the Pirkei Avot, the Chumash, the Gemara, the Mishnah Brura, the Mishnah Torah. Can I go on? Everything can be in the iPad. In one iPad, you can have the entire sources for everything. So when the rabbi is giving a shiur, shalosh shittas, you take your iPad from the chapel, you walk into the hall, and the rabbi says, we're going to learn Perek Gimel in Pirkei Avot. You push Pirkei Avot, Perek Gimel, there it is. You didn't cut down a tree to do it. I think it makes sense, but the rabbis yet don't think it makes sense. Someday, they'll maybe think it makes sense. If the whole community is doing it and the whole community says, this is where we're going and this is what it's going to be, then I think it can happen. If lights can happen with timers, other things can happen with timers. They'll create iPads that turn on before Shabbat and turn off after Shabbat automatically. You're not doing anything. You're turning pages. How is that different from turning a page? So, I mean, I can see how things are going to change because they're going to start looking for modern poskim of today to find ways, because you can't make up a new law, but you can find a way to attach your lenient position to an existing law. There are laws in place today that attach themselves to very old rulings and laws. So what does Moshe Feinstein think? What does he think? He thinks that it's okay to walk outside as long as you don't intend for your image to appear on a video monitor. So if I'm walking by and the camera's on and I'm walking through Yerushalayim and the security camera, which has to be there to protect the citizens of Israel, whether it's Shabbos or not, bad things happen even on Shabbat in the world. He said, are you walking to the kotel, for instance, because you care about the camera that's watching you? No, not really. You don't care. You're going because you want to get to shul. So you go and you walk on Shabbos, he says. Moshe Feinstein says, you're walking in the old city and you know for sure that people will be watching these monitors. There's people in security and there's room for leniency as long as your intention is for it not to happen. For example, my intention is to visit somebody or go for a walk in the old city or to go home. I'm coming home. These are Rav Moshe's exact words. He says, since the image on the screen is not permanent when you are standing in front of the camera, then the image is not permanent. The worst that it could be is a rabbinic violation. So in other words, you walk in front of the camera, it takes your thing, you walk away, it's gone. It's not permanent. Well, maybe it's more permanent than Rav Moshe Feinstein thinks, because Rav Moshe Feinstein was not an expert in technology, but he was an expert in Jewish law. You know, these cameras are recording 24/7. Everything is being digitally recorded. He doesn't talk about that. I'm bringing that up because I thought about that later. And what I'm thinking about is not a chiddush. Believe me, there's much smarter people out there than I am, and they're thinking about it way ahead of me. It just happens to be something I thought about. It's saved on a disk, David Goldberg says. Therefore, it is permanent. But in Rav Moshe's opinion, it's not permanent, right? That's what he says. But I agree with you. It's more permanent than we think. It's being saved on a disk. So we have to be careful what we throw away. You know, you can't just take a Siddur with permanent with Hashem, Shem Hashem on it and throw it in the garbage. You know, we have to bury them. We have to take them for Geniza. By the way, some of my biggest treasures that I have from Europe, from the old country, in the way of Haggadahs and Machzorim and Chumashim and other books, are from the what people take into the shul and put on the table for the discard table. What people take from their grandparents and they want to bury. And I found once a Haggadah from Krakow from the early 1900s, late 1800s, and it's just beautiful. And I gave a sermon on it one time because when you open up the pages, you can see the wine stains that are probably 100 years old on this Haggadah. And I was thinking to myself, those stains of wine almost represent the tears of the pogroms back in those days of Krakow and Poland, and we're discarding treasures. But I also understand that you can't keep everything. You can't keep everything. It's hard. You know, otherwise we're going to be junk collectors. Chazon Danto used to tell me he was a junk collector. He's not a junk collector. He said, I'm a garbage collector. He had more music than anybody I know. Was all donated, by the way, to schools and to museums and libraries in Eretz Yisrael, for people to resource. He had the greatest collection of opera and everything, but you can't keep everything. You can't keep everything. Things, but they weren't discarded. This collection went to great places. But I found, he used to say, do you have this piece of music? He said, I have it, but I don't know where it is. You know, he was a garbage collector. He saved everything. So Rav Moshe says, since it's not permanent, the worst that it could be is a rabbinic violation. He says the Torah prohibition of creating an image or writing something permanent is really what's the Torah prohibition. And since, as far as the person walking along and having the image on the monitor is concerned, he said, as far as that's concerned, he says, we don't care about that. And because you don't care about it, he says, since we're only talking about a rabbinic prohibition at worst, we don't care about the image on the monitor. And he says, one of the biggest words you can hear in rabbinic languages, are you ready? Mutar. Mutar. It's what we all want to hear. Permitted. Mutar means permitted. So he opened up a big door, because this is Rav Moshe speaking. You can walk by, your intention isn't to, you go and you visit your auntie and you walk up to her house and she's not, you know, so religious, and the camera's coming on, the lights are coming on, everything's coming on. And you walk up and it's Friday, it's Shabbat. You don't have to worry about it because you're coming to see your auntie. You're not coming to turn on the light. That's not your intention. That doesn't mean that you can set motion sensors all up over your house. When I walk by this one, it'll turn on the television. When I walk by this one, it'll turn on my computer. When I walk, because then your intentions are more intentional, if there's such a thing. So what is the leniency? What is the reason here? The reason to a leniency in the two cases, which we have seen, is complicated, but the problem with a motion sensor is really a big problem. Years ago, we could say that we could live without these devices. We didn't need them. We didn't care about them. We didn't even want them. But today, they're all around us. And because they're all around us and they're part of our society and part of what we have to do, we accept it. We just accept it. So there's a perfect example of accepting things. I want to just see if I can do screen share and share something with you. Let me see if I can do this. I'm no expert. Here, let me take this up. I'm opening this. Now I go back to this and I go share screen. I don't even know what I'm doing here. It's not letting me. All right. You still hear me? All right. We have a couple of minutes and I want to talk about something else. And I wanted to show it to you, but I'm having trouble sharing it. So please, I have it on my desktop on my computer. And if you email me sometime, whenever you want, and ask me, I will send you the tshuva, which is very interesting, by the Sephardic Orthodox rabbis on Zooming on Pesach. So what is allowed on Zooming? We're allowed right now to hear Megillat Esther on Zoom. We're allowed to visit somebody who's sick on Zoom, which is called a Bikur Cholim visit. We're not supposed to be davening on Zoom, but we do it in our community. We're not supposed to count the minyan on Zoom, but we do it in our community. We're not supposed to say Kaddish on Zoom, but we do it in our community. Personally, I think if we didn't do it, we would have been in dread for the last couple of years, because what would we have had? This connected us. This kept us connected. And because it connected us and kept us connected, there will be a time when we won't be able to use it as an excuse anymore. Will it continue? 100%. It's not going anywhere. It's going to stay. Just because something continues and it's something you do doesn't necessarily make it right. if I drive to shul on Shabbat, it's because I want to go to shul on Shabbat. And I'm going to take the chance of doing that because it's more important for me to see my people and be with my friends. If I'm going to do anything that is not Shabbosdik, it's because you choose to do it. But to intentionally do something during the weekday, it's something that you can decide for yourself. So I'm not going to tell you whether or not you should do anything or not. Who am I? You see me every morning on Zoom. I'm there. Whether I count in the minyan or not, I don't care. Because you know what it's done? I have to tell you something. This is the remarkable part. Some of us here came to shul every morning. Before Zooming, they were there every morning. Tallis and tefillin, tallis and tefillin, tallis and tefillin. But here's something that nobody else has mentioned. I'm seeing a lot of people putting on tallis and tefillin and coming to Zoom minyanim every day that never did when they never came to shul. So whether or not it's counted or not counted, guess what is counted? Your own tefillot are counted. Your prayers count. Your putting on a tallis and tefillin count. Your prayers count. So regardless of the minyan, I love seeing the people because I get to see all of you in the morning or in the afternoon. I look forward to it. And I think if it connects us, that's extremely important. I'm less concerned about the minyan. I'm less concerned about whether or not we're a minyan, we're 10, we're 20, we're 5, we're 2, we're just 1. If I'm all by myself in my house and I'm in this room and I'm davening in the morning or in the afternoon, the evening, I'm saying the tefillot. So for all of you that come and are saying the tefillot, the prayers, you're saying the prayers. If you didn't have the Zoom to look forward to, maybe you wouldn't even say the prayers. Maybe you wouldn't even come. You would say, Zoom's not on. I'm going to bake cookies. I'm going to clean the chandelier for Pesach. So instead, you come to the Zoom minyan, you say prayers, whether it's for yourself or whether it's for being part of a community. I don't care. You're actually saying the prayers. And you can clean the chandelier in the fridge later on, right? So there is a ruling, and this was the response by Rabbi Weiss to the Shevet Halevi, who wrote a whole thing. And he said that, where there's room to discuss. But he said this, he said, I saw a ruling of several rabbanim that permitted participation of the Seder through Zoom. He said, in my opinion, God forbid to be lenient on this. There is a possibility of doing a Shabbat and Yom Tov violation through this. And he said these rabbis relied on their opinion on the Sephardic poskim, and they are basing their opinion on the early Sephardic opinion that there is no prohibition to turn a light on or off on Yom Tov. So did you know that? For the Sephardim, there's no prohibition to turn a light on Yom Tov. I didn't say Shabbos, Yom Tov. We do have a prohibition to turn a light on and off on Yom Tov in the Ashkenazi world, but we don't have a prohibition to turn it up or down. So if you have a rheostat is something that makes something brighter or darker, you're allowed to adjust that dimmer, just like you're allowed to adjust the flame on the stove on Yom Tov. You can make the flame higher or lower. You can turn the element higher or lower, but you can't turn the element off once it's on Yom Tov. Therefore, we use a blech, we use a sheet of metal to make a barrier and all. But the point is that you can adjust the flame, but you can't turn the flame on and off on Yom Tov. In the Sephardic world, technically, they relied on the opinion that you could turn it on. And therefore, the Sephardic rabbis were allowing Zooming for the Seder on Pesach, which the Ashkenazim were not. So they said, except for the problem, an activity of the weekday, doing something like that, it cheapens Shabbat. I love the expression, it cheapens Shabbat. Don't cheapen something. Always do your best. So it's not a violation on Yom Tov, but it's considered a weekday activity. There's the reason for why the Ashkenazim wouldn't want you to play a radio through a timer on Shabbat. Because the radio would be considered a weekday activity. It's not in keeping with Shabbat. So he says, even though many Ashkenazi rabbis are very strict about electricity on Yom Tov, even according to their opinion, this is only someone who turns on the light or turns the light off on an electric appliance. But the Moroccan rabbis, so the Sephardic Moroccan rabbis said, when the light is already lit and you are making use of it in order to communicate with someone else, for sure, it's not a violation. And this is how the Sephardic Moroccan rabbis permitted Zoom on a Seder. That's why last year during the pandemic, I'll send you the tshuva. They came out with the tshuva and they said, we're going to allow it. So are they more lenient? Ruth, not always. Sometimes they're more strict and sometimes they're more lenient. Depends on what it is. Rav Avadia Yosef, when it came to donuts on Hanukkah, said the Ashkenazim can eat whatever donuts the non-Jews are making in the shop. But for our community, we're going to eat it only if they're put into the oil by a Jewish hands. So the Sephardic rabbis on some things are more strict, and on other things they're more lenient. But they have a more lenient opinion to electricity on Yom Tov, and that's why they were allowing Zoom on a Seder. But what was the reasoning? It wasn't anything to do. They couldn't just say, put on Zoom because you want to. So the rabbis in the Sephardic community all signed off saying it was okay, and I'm going to explain why in a minute. But first, let's just finish with the tshuva. Rav Weiss says, they made a mistake. He said, I also wrote Sheilot Utshuvot. I also wrote questions and answers. The Minchat Asher, even though the Sephardic rabbis held this opinion and a few Ashkenazi rabbis didn't, he said Rav Epstein, Rav Michael Epstein, he's known as the, I spoke about him, the Orach HaShulchan. He finds lenient opinions everywhere. I love, if I had to have one set of books in the house, I buy the Orach HaShulchan. I didn't say the Shulchan Aruch, notice, I said the Orach HaShulchan. Rav Michael Epstein, he beautiful set of volume of books. I think there's 30 volumes, but what a set. And he permitted electricity on Yom Tov. He said it's okay on Yom Tov. But the truth is, all of those who permitted turning on appliances on Yom Tov didn't understand the essence of electricity and thought that in their own innocence, that the heat of the fire is hidden inside the wires. Don't forget, this goes back a long time ago. They didn't understand technology. They said the heat of the fire that's being created is inside. Well, that would take us in a whole different direction, because then we'd say, what about LED today? LED doesn't work the same as incandescent bulbs. But the person that is doing or revealing or unleashing the fire in the wires, in their imagination, they thought to compare someone who turns on the electricity to transferring fire on Yom Tov. They compared it to transferring fire on Yom Tov. What does that mean? It means that if you have a yahrzeit candle that lasts 4 days and you light it before Yom Tov and you want to light your stove or you want to use it, you're allowed to take a piece of paper, light the fire on Yom Tov from the flame, take that flame outside, light your barbecue on Yom Tov, and as long as you don't turn the barbecue completely off and you just leave it on low, you can light from your yahrzeit candle a cigar. You can have a cigar on Yom Tov if you want. Esther, you can have a cigar on Yom Tov. Just what you wanted. So that's why in the old days at Beth Emeth in Mr. Berger's kitchen, I used to see that the men used to go into the kitchen on Yom Tov, and they had an old gas stove, and they'd go in there and they would light their cigarettes off the old gas stove in Mr. Berger's kitchen, and they would run outside with their cigarette, and the hallway in the front of the shul would stink like cigarettes on Yom Tov. Even on Yom Kippur, they smoked cigarettes on Yom Tov because you were allowed to do it. They couldn't do it without. So it's a different world today. So the truth is not so much that there isn't power or fire in the wires. It's about which Moroccan rabbi wrote what. They wrote, even according to those who are strict, that's only if someone turns on the electricity on Yom Tov. This is not the case of Zoom. Zoom, and this also, by the way, is where the rabbis failed in their knowledge of technology, but let it be. Nobody pays attention to where the rabbis fail. They only pay attention to, oh, I can have it. Too late, I already did it. Everybody loves the leniencies of the rabbis. It's like when Kor sent out a notice a few years ago, and the notice said, kosher alert. The shrimp ring that is being sold at Metro accidentally had an OU on it. It's not kosher, don't buy it. I have to tell you that? You know already that you can't buy it and have it. But it said OU, Rabbi. I bought it. It said OU. I figured it was kosher and I ate it already. Too late. We know that just because. So the rabbis didn't know. They said, if you turn on Zoom before Yom Tov, it'll just stay on. I'm not so sure that if you turn on Zoom tonight for the morning minyan tomorrow, that your computer will still stay on and have Zoom already there, that you don't have to refresh a page or do something. I'm sure it doesn't work that way. I haven't tried it, but most people just turn on their computer, they put the Zoom at the end of the Seder, and they did it. So it's a mistake that they're making, he wrote. But let me tell you what their reasoning was. Their reasoning was not about electricity. The reason the Moroccan rabbis signed off on it was because of pressure from the community. And here's what the pressure was. Aside from the concerns, Rabbi Weiss writes, it is clear as the midday sun. That's what he writes. It's as clear as the midday sun. I love it. It's like saying, in my humble opinion, right? He says, if we permit using Zoom for the Seder, there will be a great breakdown of Halacha, and we will not be able to explain what's different from Shabbat and next Shabbat. It sounds like, to me, that Rabbi Weiss is now doing a 180 and turning around and saying you can't do it. He's saying there'll be a breakdown of Halacha. It sounds like he's just about to say, I wanted to give you permission, but I'm going to take it away. But at the end, they give in. And listen to this. Because we know that in every place, this is the very next sentence. He says, because we know that in every place, there are isolated people and sick people stuck at home. And they will say, if you permit a Zoom Seder this year, you should permit it because they already are permitting this thing. It's already being done. I love that. It's so sensible. And I'm going to tell you how sensible it is in a minute. Everything connected to using this electric stuff. And he says in his tshuva, stuff. I love that, in context. He says, everything connected to using this stuff on Shabbat, any little break in the halacha will be expanded and is likely to collapse the wall of faith. So he's not saying you should absolutely go ahead and doing it, but he's saying that we know that there is possible room for leniency. So what did they write at the end of the day? What did the Sephardic rabbis write? I've got to let you go because it's 12:37, but I got to finish this quickly. Here's the tshuva by the rabbis in Morocco and Israel. I'll read it very quickly, and then I'll say, we were asked by a Torah scholar, is it possible to turn on Zoom application for the Seder night? We will connect families who cannot be in the same place because of the spread of the epidemic in order to make the Seder together through the computer together. One screen is one person's house, the other in the other person's home, and they join together through the program on the computer, which is turned on before the Seder? Sure it is. And is not necessarily to do anything on Yom Tov. Sure it's not. The question is it possible to use this program as permission for a time of urgent emergency only? Tshuva. Here it is. There are three central problems. 1, turning on the program on Yom Tov. 2, You are not allowed to do weekday things on Yontif. 3, that it will come that people might use it on Yontif even when it's not an extreme case of an emergency. Why are they putting that in there? They're putting it in there to protect themselves. It's like me saying to you, you can put a Band-Aid on to cover the wound, but when you go to take the Band-Aid off, it's going to hurt. That's not my fault. That's the Band-Aid company. They made it sticky, not me. So in other words, we're not telling you yet you can't use Zoom. What we're saying is there are problems to using it. You've got to find a way to leave it on a Yontif. You got to find not to turn it off. You got to find, right? They're saying, but that's your problem. But the connecting through it, they say, as far as the concern that people will do it in the future and not in an emergency, right? Not just last year. They're afraid they're going to keep on doing it. He says, it's obvious that it's for an emergency. The holiday of Pesach is an important time. Everyone views it as a special time for family connection. Many of the younger generation, if not for their connection with their grandparents, that some will not even sit at a Seder at all. You know, university students, I'm not at home, I'm not with my parents, I'm not with their grandparents, so I'll order a pizza. It's not what we want. We want to send them a Pesach meal. We want them to connect to us through the Seder. They want the kids to see their grandparents, so you do it on that Zoom. And he says, for this generation, it's very important to return the heart of the children to the parents and the hearts of the parents to the children. And furthermore, there's one more issue, to get rid of sadness from the older people, to give them motivation to continue and to prevent depression. I love that. And he says, depression in the light of a pandemic can cause them to give up hope. And that's the worst thing. Therefore, we sign this document of a tshuva to allow people to use Zoom Leil HaSeder. To me, it was sensible. You know why? Because the rabbis know, they don't want to admit it, but they know it's not going to be for a one-time thing. If you have a relative in France, if you have a relative in Germany, if you have a relative in Israel, if you have a relative in the Ukraine, you want to be able to connect to that person and give them a Seder that they can connect with, and you do it through Zoom. It's better than not doing it at all. So sometimes these tshuvas create leniencies that will be continuing and continuing and continuing for years to come, whether we like it or not, out of convenience. We look for the leniencies within the laws and we find the tshuvas, and then you decide for yourself what you want to do and how you want to follow it. I wish you a good week and a Purim Sameach. And if you can't listen to a Megillah reading in person, you are allowed to listen to it on Zoom. It's completely permissible and allowed. And I wish for you only good things. And thank you for being part of the class.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very
Thanks,
informative.
Mark.